Move on now and introduce our second speaker. So our second speaker is Deandre miles-hercules. Deandre is a PhD student in the Department of Linguistics at the University of California, which is in Santa Barbara. Their research focuses on language as a nexus for the construction and performance of race, gender and sexuality, especially in relation to Black, femme, queer and trans communities. Deandre will be talking to us today about archival dialogic analysis as a way of approaching intersectional language and identity research. So Deandre, welcome. I'm going to pass over to you.
Thank you, Jay. I'm going to go ahead and try and share my screen.
This is also Deandre's first time on Teams, I should say. Both new to Teams.
So hopefully I can get this working. Yeah, a second. I'm not sure what's changed.
Is it working for you? We might need our tech hero, Fraser.
Yeah, it was working. Crap, I have to change my security and privacy setting. So let me see.
We've had 2 practice runs where this has worked fine, and now it's telling you to change your security settings.
I'm not sure why, but yeah. Yes, I can't seem to tell what's wrong. It seems like okay. Yeah.
So we'll amuse ourselves in the chat while you figure it out. But if worse comes to worse, email your presentation to me and I will show it. And I will change the slides for you.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not sure why. Well, oh, okay. Well, I think it's suddenly working now. So I imagine you can see my screen. I imagine you can see my slideshow.
We can.
Yes.
Well done.
Okay, thank you.
Over to you.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to stop my timer to make sure I don't over. All right, so as you said, I'm Deandre miles-hercules. I use they, them pronouns, and I'm a third-year PhD student in the Department of Linguistics at the University of California in Santa Barbara, which is where I'm coming to you from. And so I see we have guests from all over the place. And I am particularly thankful for those. I see I know a few people in the participants list who are coming from the United States, and I know it's very early. So I thank you in particular for your participation. So today I'm going to talk about language, identity, and what I'm calling an archival dialogic, right? And so I'm really thinking about 3 questions that I'm going to try and gesture to and answer. One of the things I'm really interested in is asking why hasn't race been integrated into the study of language and identity? And for this talk specifically, I'm focusing on gender and sexuality, queer theory, and how identity has been deployed within the field of studying language in these domains. Secondly, I'm really interested in, after we can ask that question and answer it to some extent, then what does the linguistic intersection of Blackness and queerness look like, taking as a presupposition that we don't know a whole lot about it, there hasn't been a great deal of study about it. So maybe we can gesture towards some answers here. And then broadly scaling back, I'm interested in thinking about, and this is where an archival dialogic comes in, which will become more clear as we move on, but how does that push us towards an intersectional linguistics? And I hope and think from watching Zaina's presentation that this would be very much so complementary rather than redundant. And this is going to be a long haul, but I'm really going to try, get us there in and as smooth a manner as possible as your lovely conductor. So I'm going to go back and forth between thinking about the conceptual aspects of research, of how do we integrate intersectionality into research, and then on the other hand, thinking about how we do it, right? So it's going to kind of go back and forth between the conceptual and the methodological, and I just want to forefront that that's what's going on, right? And also feel free to put your questions in the chat as they come up so that they're fresh in your mind, and we'll go back through them towards the end. So we're going to start by overviewing some of the research on identity and how it's evolved in sociocultural linguistic research over time. By sociocultural linguistic, I really mean things that are encompassed by discourse analysis, sociolinguistics, linguistic anthropological. Buckles and Hall 2008 really talks about how these things are rarely mutually exclusive and how they come together in interesting ways. And you can see Penny Epper's 2012 piece about the waves of studying linguistic variation. But initially, identity was studied not as much as we think about it now, but in terms of rote demographic categories. These are things you might find on the census. And in this variationist paradigm advanced by William LeBeau, in the late 60s or beginning in the late 60s, based on his work in New York City and some other work done in Martha's Vineyard, linguistics forms were matched to, in a quantitative sense, these demographic categories, like race or class or some other kinds of identities. And then on the other hand, we have Robin Lakoff thinking about language and gender in her piece, Language and Woman's Place, thinking less so about this quantitative sense or this correlational model, but still taking woman as a predetermined category and then thinking about the ways that language and ideology interacted with the language used by or even thought to be used by women, often in a misogynistic fashion. Moving forward into the 80s and 90s, we get more ethnographic and more contextually situated work that thought a lot more about belonging to local categories rather than predetermined ones. And so here I'm citing John Rickford's work on class distinctions in Guyana, on sugarcane plantations in particular in Guyana. And then again, looking at some of Penny Eckworth's work on how gender is situated in this piece, with kids participating in what they call the pre-adolescent heterosexual marketplace, which is really interesting. And then Marcelina Morgan thinking about African-American women's language from her ethnographic fieldwork in Chicago. But these studies notably aren't necessarily investigating how the categories themselves are constructed, right? Or how gender as a notion, race as a notion is constructed, but really how people are engaging them in their local context, which distinguishes stage 1 from stage 2. And then getting to stage 3, which I would argue is more or less where we are now, and which I'm arguing that we depart from, encompasses categories like performativity, like indexicality, coming along with this postmodern term. So when we think about things like performativity in the study of language, gender, and sexuality, people often go back to Judith Butler. They go back to Gender Trouble, really thinking about the ways that gender is the stylized repetition of acts, as Judith Butler calls it, right? So that one is not, born with a gender per se, that gender is created through accretion of different sets of linguistic practices, body comportment, personal adornment, these sorts of things. And this is where the performativity comes into play, in addition to indexicality, in the sense that linguistic forms, linguistic practices point to gender identity in the ways that it is performative. And so this is really where we are now. And what we get in terms of identity is something like what Buchholz and Hall 2005 offers us, which is just that identity is the social positioning of self and other. And I think that's an exemplar for how we more or less use identity in the field of language and sexuality today, which, gives us, one, thinking about how performativity is a big part of it, but also that the relation to others excuse me, is also deeply implicated in the construction of these identities. And so when we think about identity in this framework of language, gender, and sexuality, it was very much so ushered in with these discussions, and some of you might be familiar with this kind of historical scope of arguments about whether or not the field of language, gender, and sexuality should focus on desire, right? Who one's, partners are, in terms of whether that, marks you as heterosexual or otherwise, or should it be about how one identified within those paradigms? And Buckles Hall offer that really the two can't be torn apart or distinguished in a very clear, discrete way. In fact, they are very, very much so both important to how we think about how genders and sexualities are constructed and navigated. And this was really ushering in that queer linguistics that argued that they couldn't be separable, and it was really a challenge to hegemonic heterosexuality and the ways that non-normative sexualities are negotiated in relation to those regulatory structures. So this is thinking about identity in a really expansive and really powerful way. And so one of the things that drew it back, or one of the drawbacks, was that it was really unable to deal with race in really interesting ways. And so Kathy Cohen argues that one of the great failings of queer theory, and especially queer politics, which is what undergirds it, has been the inability to incorporate into analyses of the world and strategies for political mobilization the roles that race, class, and gender play in defining people's differing relations to dominant and normalizing power. So a really good example of this is the idea of the welfare queen. So the welfare queen is an ideological construct that targets and demonizes Black women in particular in the United States. And it came about in the 1990s in the midst of austerity measures put forth by Bill Clinton during his presidency, particularly to slash public assistance, right? And the construct was such that Black women in particular were the predominant benefits of this so-called welfare, but particularly to them as immoral for things like having more children while being on welfare, right? The idea that you shouldn't have children that you can't support in this way, right? So queer theory, the argument goes, isn't able to handle how both gendered and racialized oppression is happening in that moment, right? And so this is one of the things I'm interested in thinking about as we're talking about intersectionality. But as a consequence of that failure of queer theory, there have been relatively few studies on Black genders and sexualities from a linguistic perspective. Oh, and I should note that this spelling of erasure, I draw from Brianna Cornelius, and a forthcoming chapter she has in the Oxford Handbook of Language and Sexuality. So I want to put that out there. That is not my invention or neologism. So how do we get to race? How do we think about how race has been studied with the study of language? Or as I like to think of it, what's identity got to do with it? Because Tina Turner. So in the study of language and social life, the majority of the work on Blackness is focused on structure and performance. And I'm thinking about the work by John Rickford, Lisa Green, some by Sandra Lanehart, which are about things like consonant clusters, things about copula, right? This is about this kind of rote structural analysis that isn't about what the construction of race is like from a linguistic perspective. And a lot of that in the socio-historical context of the discipline in the academy is precipitated by traditionalism, right? Such that you are a graduate student in a formalist department. Therefore, even if you're interested in the construction of race, you have to study it from a formalist perspective, or else you aren't successful. I mean, you're not published and so forth. So this is one of my arguments about why the study of language and race hasn't been able to study race in the ways that I argue that queer theory hasn't been able to. And so I argue that one of the things that they haven't been able to get to is that race is not at all about identity. Race itself is actually fundamentally a social imposition. This is a point that I cannot highlight enough. It's not about identity at all, right? So when we think about a number of things, we think about ontology, social death, and native alienation, right? That Blackness as a form of being, and one about constructed about non-humanity, or the absence of humanity in this kind of dialogic construction coming out of the Enlightenment period. By being Black, by being born as Black, you experience natal alienation, right? As you are in the womb, it is understood that you have no natal relations that are inalienable. You can be sold off from your family, the moment you exit the womb, so to speak, right? And this is related to this legal doctrine from the antebellum period, from the enslavement period, that goes partus sequitur ventrum, which loosely translates to the child follows the mother, which is to say that the child born to any enslaved woman is also enslaved, right? So again, prediscursively in some sense, or prior to conception, in the racialized imaginary, a Black person is property. This has nothing to do with identity, right? It's a question of being, it's a question of ontology, which again, it shows us how race is a social imposition. There are a couple other examples, which is, the one drop rule, again, denoting how far removed you could have a Black ancestor and not still be enslaved, right? And so this is a very material concern that has nothing to do with how one identifies. And another example, if you all are focusing, I don't know, we have people from all over, but who's tuning into the US presidential election that's happening right now, which many of us are watching very closely, and then voter suppression. So Dr. Carol Anderson wrote a book called One Person, No Vote. And so when we think about how, because of the histories of federal redlining, for instance, that if you are Black, you're more likely to live in certain neighborhoods. And if you're in those neighborhoods, you're more likely to have polling places shut down, right, or made inaccessible by public transportation and so forth. And so I could go on, but the point that I want to take away from all the slides that I've led up to this point is that race and gender haven't been able to come together substantively in the study of language and social life because they operate on fundamentally different planes. That doesn't mean they can't come together, because intersectionality. And so that's really what I want to gesture towards, is thinking about one, how this foreclosure is baked into identity as a concept, as a fundamental concept, and how we think about language, gender, and sexuality. I don't know if you all eat pie around the holidays, but I included that picture because baking. And also, it's a lot of people's quarantine hobby. But I also argue, which is a bit more of a argument that one might bristle at, but that studying identity in a way that forecloses race itself is racist, right? Because it excludes the possibility of being able to engage with this deeply oppressing construct in favor of looking at other things that can fit within the mold of identity as performativity, identity as indexicality, and so forth. If you do find yourself bristling at this argument, I should quickly note that I'm not implying that individuals, scholars, researchers who work within these paradigms are necessarily themselves racist, right? It's an epistemological issue, right? And the study of language and identity has been formative for me. It's one of the reasons I am here, because, this is the work that's got me really excited about studying language and social life. But I think we can do better. And this is the kind of thing that I'm arguing for. One thing that's a bit tangential, I don't really have time to fully develop here, is my own contention that the way that identity has been studied in this individualized way is actually an outgrowth of neoliberalism in the ways that agency and individual agency is actually prioritized in social life, right? So when you think about neoliberalism, this is often applied to participation of individuals in the free market structure, deregulation, these sorts of things. But in the ways that that system thinks about individual agency, I think identity as performativity gets implicated in that. And so I think it's interesting to think about how we ourselves as researchers often fall prey to neoliberal discourses. But again, I don't have time to talk about that much more, because my fundamental question is, how do we bring things like race and gender together with sexuality, with class analyses? And this is how I think, my talk is a really good complement to Zaina's. And so how do we think about the conceptual underpinnings of this? I'm going to talk a little bit about intersectionality, but from a little bit of a different perspective. And so Crenshaw, as a bit of a review though, locates and unpacks how social structures and institutions fail to account for the particularized experiences of women of color. That's our main focus in this 1989 article. Excuse me, but I do think it's really important to understand the context of this article. So what she introduces with is this 1976 case, the Graff and Reed versus General Motors. And in this case, this lawsuit brought against General Motors by 5 Black women, all of whom had been hired and fired by General Motors in the 10 years between 1964, when the Civil Rights Act was passed, and 1974. And so they sued, alleging that they were discriminated against specifically as Black. General Motors, in their defense, argued, well, we hire women. Never mind that all of them are white. They were administrative assistants. They argued, we hire Black people. Never mind that all of them are men, and these men who are working on the assembly line, who are working on the floor. And the court judge agreed with them and argued that because there was no precedent for a specific discrimination against Black women, that the plaintiffs could not bring together statutes targeting or prohibiting gender discrimination and racial discrimination to form what he called some super remedy to alleviate their specific condition. And so this is why I'm interested in drawing back from thinking about identity as an individualized construct and thinking about the structural dimensions of how Black women in particular have been written out of the archive, which I'm going to talk about a little more in a bit, but how we can integrate this structural account back into our study of language and social life. Queer theory is another way of thinking about this, coming from E. Patrick Johnson, which is more situated in performance studies and queer theory, which again is a way to critique some stable notions of identity, but at the same time to locate racialized and class knowledges. And it's a theory of and for people, lesbians of color, women of color, and so forth. And so again, I think in order to move the needle forward, we have to think of some different methods. We have to become, as Christina Sharp calls, undisciplined, right? And she argues that the work that we do requires new modes and methods of research and teaching, new ways of entering and leaving the archives of slavery. And so this motif of the archive is going to come up through the rest of the talk. I think it's really important to think about. But also, as Mary Buckholtz and I write in a piece that's forthcoming, that thinking differently requires us to move differently, right? So this is a question of epistemology. Once we know that our epistemological underpinning is flawed or is faulty, which I hope you agree with me on that point, it means we need to approach methods differently. It means we need to kind of open up and rethink the ways that we are attempting to study this thing. So it's not an issue of content, but how do we even approach looking at that content, studying that content? So I argue that in order to fully reckon with the consequences of intersectionality and all of its implications in the structural domain, that we must attend to the factors that produce the conditions which necessitates an intersectional intervention in the first place. These are things like systemic oppression, misogynoir, anti-Blackness, and so forth. And these things are related to the sparsity of the archive, again, and some kind of decontextualized analysis of language and practice. And I hope this will all become clear in this slide, which is going to be a lot, but please bear with me. So I really think about the archive as a place where we can start to move the needle on this. So I argue and suggest that we might set our research in conversation with the archive, right? So this is discourse you're studying, and you put it in direct conversation or dialogue with history, media, art, visual art, paintings, and so forth, pamphlets from, revolutionary organizations in the 1970s, if so relevant, artifacts. It really can be anything, but it really is about setting and contextualizing your discourse in the structures in which it exists. And I think of that as a process of excavation and transformation, of really unearthing, and hopefully this will become clear with some data examples I'll give, with excavating the archive itself, individual materials, these media, across these various media, but also excavating embedded power relations that are buried and made unmarked within the production of a normative and hegemonic archive. And so Saidiya Hartman talks about the archive, to be clear, as a death sentence, a tomb, a display of the violated body, an inventory of property, a medical treatise on gonorrhea, a few lines about a whore's life, an asterisk in the grand narrative of history. And so when I say archive, I'm really thinking about that grand narrative of human history and the ways in which certain folks have been written out of that. So we're thinking about excavating and transforming the archive to prohibit that effectively. And we're using the research process to do it. The research process is one that is spatiotemporally situated, and it is producing the archive. The data that you collect in your research is producing the archive. Your analysis of that data is producing the archive, right? Bakhtin says that words belong to nobody, and in themselves, they evaluate nothing, right? And so the analyses that we produce is providing the context for further analyses. And so in this attention to the archive, I really hearken that we pay specific attention to the roles of systemic oppression in producing and maintaining the archive. Now, how do we do this? I think about this as what I'm calling tentatively, and I'm working through this, so work with me as well. But I call it a layered interchange complex. And so I'm thinking about how we can set up this dialogic in a couple of ways. So I think at 3 different levels of our research process, we can start to get this going. From the micro-contextual discourse, which is just that situated face-to-face, or the textual analysis you're doing, maybe it's a corpus analysis. That's the researcher and the text. That's really the first level. That's a traditional level of analysis. You're doing, your inquiry into what's going on, what you're seeing in the data. But I think a next level is thinking about how your data is situated within the archive, right, in the broader socio-cultural and spatio-temporal context. So just to draw an example off the hat, if I was thinking about Zionist's data, I'd be really interested in the BBC, and the BBC's history from a structural lens of thinking about and working with Saudi women in particular, right? What does that political background look like? I'd be really interested in it. But then at the 3rd level, we think about meta-analysis. And this is about how you, as a researcher, from marked positionalities in so many ways, are engaging with the data, but then producing an analysis of your analysis, so to speak. How is your analysis informed by that positionality, and what kind of relationship it produced between you and your data, right? And so I think of these as 3 individual dialogues happening simultaneously, but at each level, there's conversation between them, if that makes sense. And this is why I think of it as a layered complex of interchange. So in the last few minutes, I'll try and think about it. I know that was a lot, so take a breath. And now I'm going to try and walk through how I apply this in the context of my own research. And so I'm going to be using an example from a semi-structured interview I conducted as a part of my master's thesis research a couple of years ago at this point. Wow. And in thinking about how I really apply this archival dialogic analysis. And so this is a clip coming from Troy Zell, who admittedly is one of my friends, but colleagues from undergrad. This person is a graduate student in a performance studies PhD program, but I asked them about their linguistic experience of gender specifically, is what I asked, and this was their response.
This goes back to Paris learning, right? That like community is like forged within language, right? Like that's all those terms and all the, you know what I mean? Like that's it elaborates itself as as a linguistic imperative. I think that's fantastic. This is actually hilarious because I literally was watching Shit Black Gays Say, and like I always say this, but I'm like those videos taught me how to be gay. Like, you know what I mean? Like they taught me like language, they taught me the lexicon, and like that they taught me not only just the lexicon, the performance of the lexicon, right? The like what it the context of it. And so I think that wow. Wow, give that to an undergrad. That's a project. Like, you know what I mean? But like that is actually like I came to understanding that intersection of my race and gender, right? And sexuality, obviously, by way of language. And I mean, language structures all of our identity, but I'm not getting into psychoanalysis today. Please stop it. But yeah, you know what I mean? Like that. So yeah, that's. And so I'm able to, because I know the lexicon, I know the language, and I know that it's for the most part shared, I now, right, am able to extend, right, my arms towards community in the ways of, you know, talk.
Okay, and you do that actively, do you think?
Yeah. For sure.
And so, as you can see, I've highlighted and underlined some points that I think are particularly worth noting. And so in the last couple of minutes, I'll really try and walk through these three levels of analysis I've suggested. So at the first level, this kind of micro-contextual, you can think about how Troisel focuses on community rather than identity, which forms the crux of their experience. And so this is a place where, in the situated context of a Black, queer, and femme community, that community becomes that place where linguistic form becomes an important index rather than this self-referential identity. Troisel describes community as a linguistic imperative. Again, they put it very clearly, but then they also make explicit references to media as how they learned how to do this, how to insert or assert that linguistic imperative. They use it as a tool to extend one's arms toward community in the way of talk. I would also note that the structural analysis that one might do if you were interested in looking at syntactic structures, if you were interested in a phonetic or prosodic analysis, or the structure of discourse, turn-taking, laughter, that sort of thing, that this is where you would apply that as well. But then on the other hand, there are all these media references. And so it's important for me to go to these sources as a way of further contextualizing not just what Troisel's experience is like, but what the broader community and history of this intersection of Blackness, gender, and sexuality is like. And so quickly, I'm going to try and go through by asking how your micro-contextual discourse speaks through the archive. I think this is the question you should really be asking at this stage. And so I have a couple of examples that Troisel was using. So here's one called Shit Black Gays Say. It was a really popular video posted almost 10 years ago by Gregory Smith, also known as Kid Fury. Some of you may know him as one of the hosts of the podcast The Read. But in this video, he's much younger. He says,
Yo, Shady. Shade comes from reading. Reading came first.
And so this was so beautiful to me because Troisel also mentioned Paris is Burning. In fact, this is a direct, as we're thinking about Bakhtin, a direct revoicing and vocalization of a scene from Paris is Burning, a relatively famous one that I'm sure many of you are familiar with. So this is Dorian Corey.
Shade comes from reading. Reading came first.
And so it's really interesting that Troisel is speaking back to Shit Black Gays Say, but Kid Fury is speaking back to Paris is Burning, right? So thinking about that interconnectivity is something that is really only possible when we think about this archival inquiry. For those of you who aren't familiar with what shade is, Dorian Corey also provides us a definition.
Shade is, I don't tell you're ugly, but I don't have to tell you because you know you're ugly.
And that's what shade is, according to Dorian Corey. And so in this last bit, I'm going to think about how you come back and scale back for that meta-analysis, but it's really about positionality, right? And you're asking yourself, where are you in the analysis? And writing about it, you're explicitly marking that unmarked as a researcher, right? How does your experience Mark, your analysis and your interpretation of the data. For me, in this study, it was about this kind of Oedipus synthesis, right? That I'm in some ways a part of the community that is shared between me and Troyzell, but I'm also coming to it with the lens of these analytic tools that are not shared. And so for me, my analysis is balancing and thinking about that tension, about how I'm a community member who's native to these linguistic practices, and also in a phenomenological sense, shares experience of the world at large. And this is one that Dorian Corey, which is again my interaction and relationship to the archive. It's probably no surprise to you that Paris is Burning is one of my favorite things ever. But it's because Dorian Corey speaks to an experience that I have as a person and as a researcher. And so Dorian Corey provides us with this.
Now, the fact that you are not an executive is merely because of the social standing of life. That is just a pure thing. Black people have a hard time getting anywhere. And those that do are usually straight.
And so to end, because I know I'm going just a little over, that this archival dialogic in the final instance, it tells us about linguistic practices, but it also tells us about power and the social world that we inhabit. And it also pushes, and this is what it looks like for me moving forward, moving from identity to thinking more about identifications and foregrounding that relationship between systemic oppression and social life, and thinking about agency in the construction of communities through language. That's the future directions. Thank you all, because, you know, the election. Questions?
Thank you so much, Deandre. Yeah, I was thinking this was a particularly tough time for you to be having to do this presentation, but it was fantastic, really thought-provoking, and I think one that we really need to hear as a group, you know, who focuses on language, gender and sexuality, and who have that in our title. I think